Everyone thought these twins were the Mafia's greatest weakness, until their caretaker decided to stop medicating them and start training them. Tonight, a rival hit squad thinks they're walking into a nursery. They have no idea they're walking into a slaughterhouse. Kafingji, the most feared man in the underworld, watches his monitors in horror. His security is breached, and 6 assassins are seconds away from his son's door. He thinks he's about to watch his legacy die. But on the screen, Sonnia, a Black American caretaker with a hidden past, isn't hiding. She's locking the door and turning medical supplies into weapons. Behind her stand Shuk and Chuk, the disabled heirs who are about to prove that a tiger is most dangerous when it's been cornered in its own home. This isn't a rescue mission. It's a revelation. Kindly like and subscribe. The digital hum of the nursery died a sudden, violent death. The high-definition screens, once glowing with a cold, watchful light, flickered and vanished, plunging the suite into a thick, suffocating darkness. Sonnia froze. She didn't need the security monitors to tell her what was happening. The silence itself was a siren. In the Geum-Ryong estate, the power didn't just fail, it was severed. Shuk, Chuk, don't move, Sonnia whispered, her voice low and steady despite the adrenaline hammering against her ribs. She could hear their ragged breathing, Shuk-jin's quick and shallow, Chuk-jin's rattling with the tremors that always intensified when he was afraid. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, her fingers finding the heavy tactical flashlight she'd kept on her person since the day she realized Kafingji's inner circle was rotting from the inside. But she didn't turn it on. A light in this darkness was a target. Instead, she moved with a practiced, feline grace toward the twins' medical storage. Outside in the hallway, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed, rhythmic, professional, and moving fast. They were coming. Sonnia grabbed 2 portable pulse oximeters from the charging station. These devices had tiny, glowing red LED displays. She clicked them on and tucked them under the edge of the bed and behind a heavy curtain. The faint, crimson luminescence didn't light up the room, but it created long, distorted shadows that danced against the walls, making the furniture look like crouching figures. To an assassin entering a dark room, those red pinpricks of light would look like eyes or weapon sights. It was a distraction, a way to make them hesitate for the 1 second she needed. Next, she moved to Chuk-jin's oxygen concentrator. With a sharp tug, she disconnected the plastic tubing and draped it across the floor like a tripwire, hidden in the deep shadows. "Get behind the reinforced partition," she commanded, guiding the 18-year-old twins into the small, lead-lined alcove meant for X-ray equipment. "Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, you stay small." She felt Shuk-jin's hand brush hers, a silent, desperate squeeze. "Sonnia," he breathed. "I've got you," she replied, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She pulled a heavy, stainless steel oxygen tank from its bracket, the cold metal feeling solid and lethal in her grip. In the distance, the first boom of a breaching charge shook the floor. Somewhere in the city, Kafingji was likely watching a dead feed, realizing too late that his fortress had been compromised. But here, in the shadows of the nursery, Sonnia wasn't a nanny anymore. She was a ghost in the dark, and she was waiting. The blacked-out sedan tore through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, its engine a low, predatory growl that mirrored the fury inside Kafingji's chest. The Mafia boss stared at the tablet in his lap, his knuckles white against the expensive leather casing. The screen was a mosaic of signal lost warnings, but one hidden backup feed. A pinhole camera he'd installed without even the security team's knowledge flickered to life. It showed the hallway leading to the nursery. He watched in visceral horror as 6 figures in tactical gear, their faces obscured by matte black masks, moved with the synchronized grace of professional killers. They weren't there to kidnap, they were there to erase. 10 minutes, boss, the driver rasped, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He saw a version of Kafingji he had never seen before, not the cold, calculated businessman, but a father whose world was shrinking down to a grainy, low-light digital feed. 10 minutes is a death sentence, the Mafia boss whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. On the screen, the lead assassin raised a silenced submachine gun, signaling the breach. Kafingji felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as he watched the heavy, reinforced door of the suite shudder under a silent, hydraulic force. He was a man who had built an empire on surveillance and control, yet he was now a helpless spectator to his own heart being ripped out. The camera angle shifted as the hit squad entered the suite. The nursery was a tomb of shadows, punctuated only by the eerie, red glow of the medical devices Sonnia had scattered across the floor. Kafingji's breath hitched. Through the static, he saw a silhouette standing in the center of the room, Sonnia. She looked small against the looming threat of 6 armed men, but she didn't move. She stood like a sentinel between the killers and the alcove where his sons, Shuk and Chuk were hidden. Faster! Kafingji roared, slamming his fist against the partition. The tablet hummed with the vibration of a suppressed gunshot. He saw a spark of light reflect off a metal canister in the room, and then the screen dissolved into a blizzard of gray noise. The connection was dead. The Mafia boss sat in the sudden, deafening silence of the car, his eyes burning. He realized then that the woman he had hired to simply watch his sons was currently the only thing standing between them and the abyss. He gripped his weapon, counting every agonizing second, praying that Sonnia's courage could buy him the 10 minutes he didn't have. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, the wood splintering inward under the relentless pressure of a hydraulic ram. In the suffocating darkness of the nursery, the only light came from the eerie, rhythmic red pulse of the oximeter Sonnia had strategically placed. As the first gap in the door appeared, a silenced muzzle flash flickered like a dying star. Sonnia didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the risk or think about the lead tearing through the air. She simply moved. Chuk, paralyzed by a neurological tremor that had seized his legs, was frozen in the open space between the alcove and the safety of the heavy mahogany bed. "Get down," Sonnia screamed, her voice a raw, primal command that cut through the mechanical hiss of the suppressed gunfire. She lunged across the floor, her body becoming a blurred barrier of flesh and bone. A bullet, intended for the center of the young man's chest, hissed through the air. It didn't find its mark. Instead, it tore through the meat of Sonnia's shoulder, the impact spinning her around like a broken doll. The pain was a white-hot iron, searing and blinding, but she used the momentum of the hit to shove Chuk with everything she had left. He slid across the polished floor, disappearing into the dark sanctuary beneath the bed just as a second round whistled over his head. Sonnia hit the floor hard, the metallic tang of blood filling her senses. She didn't cry out. She couldn't afford the breath. Gasping through the agony, she rolled onto her good side, her eyes searching the shadows for Shuk, who was huddled behind the lead-line partition, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. The door finally gave way, crashing against the interior wall with a deafening thud. 3 shadows stepped into the room, their goggles glowing a faint, ghostly green. To them, the room was a confusing maze of red flickering lights and distorted shapes. They moved with a predatory caution, unaware that the woman they had just shot was already reaching for the heavy oxygen tank she had hidden in the gloom. Blood soaked through Sonnia's scrubs, hot and sticky, but her gaze remained locked on the entrance. She knew Kafingji was out there, racing through the city, watching a dead screen and fearing the worst. She couldn't let his fears come true. She looked toward the bed where Chuk lay hidden, and then toward the partition where Shuk waited. The pain in her shoulder was nothing compared to the fierce, burning need to see them safe. As the lead assassin stepped over the threshold, Sonnia gripped the steel tank, her teeth bared in a silent, bloody snarl. "Stay down," she whispered toward the twins, her voice a ghost of a promise. She cracked the valve on the oxygen tank, the hiss of escaping gas filling the room. She wasn't just slowing them down anymore. She was preparing to turn the nursery into a pressure cooker. If they wanted the twins, they would have to slide through hell to get to them. The heavy mahogany door to the inner sanctuary shuddered under a fresh assault, the wood groaning as the assassins outside regained their footing on the chemical-slicked floor. Sonnia leaned her back against the frame, the cold wood pressing into her wounded shoulder, a stark contrast to the white-hot agony radiating through her arm. She knew the barricade wouldn't hold much longer. The hydraulic hiss of their tools sounded like the breathing of a mechanical beast, patient and inevitable. With trembling fingers, Sonnia pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen's glow was a pale, ghostly blue in the darkness of the room. She hit the record button, her breath hitching as she turned the camera toward the twins. Shuk was huddled behind the lead-lined partition, his hands gripped white-knuckle tight around his cane, while Chuk watched from beneath the bed, his eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. Chuk, look at me, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of steel. If the world goes quiet after this door opens, I need you to remember one thing. People spent 18 years looking at your tremors and your canes and calling you broken. They whispered that you were a weakness in your father's empire. Another thunderous boom shook the door, sending a shower of splinters over her hair. Sonnia didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the boys. They were wrong. You weren't broken. You were chosen. You survived a poison that should have taken you as infants, and you grew up in a world that tried to dim your light every single day. That isn't weakness. That is a strength most men will never understand. You are the only part of this family that is pure. You are the only part worth saving. She coughed, the metallic taste of blood rising in her throat, but she forced a small, heartbreaking smile for the lens. Kafingji, if you're watching this, don't let them go back into a cage. They are ready to lead. They are ready to be sons. The door frame gave a final, sickening crack. Sonnia set the phone down on a nightstand, the camera still rolling, capturing the silhouette of a woman standing tall despite her trembling limbs. She picked up the heavy steel oxygen tank, bracing her feet as best she could. I love you both, she breathed, her voice barely audible over the final breach. Now, show them that a sun never truly sets. As the door burst open and the first masked figure lunged through the dust, Sonnia didn't move back. She stepped forward, a human shield fueled by a love that was far more lethal than any bullet the Mafia boss could ever fire. The first assassin through the door didn't see a woman. He saw an obstacle. He swung the butt of his rifle with a sickening thud, catching Sonnia across her already shattered shoulder. She collapsed like a bird with a broken wing, her phone skittering across the floor, still recording the carnage. A low, agonized moan escaped her lips as fresh blood blossomed across the floor, mixing with the slippery medical gel. From behind the lead-line partition, Shuk watched the light leave Sonnia's eyes. Time didn't slow down, it shattered. For 18 years, he had been told his legs were his failure, that the tremors in his nerves made him a spectator in his own life. But as the masked man raised his weapon to finish the woman who had spent months teaching him he was a giant, a dormant, ancestral fire ignited in Shuk's chest. He didn't reach for his cane. He reached for the rage he had buried under years of specialized care. With a guttural roar that tore through his throat, Shuk lunged from the shadows. His movements were jagged, uncoordinated, and fueled by a desperation that bypassed his damaged nerves. He used the weight of his own body, throwing himself at the lead killer. As he fell, he swung his right leg with a violent, whipping motion. The heavy, medical-grade steel of his reinforced leg brace, designed to stabilize his gait, became a lethal mace. The metal struck the assassin squarely in the temple with a resonant, bone-breaking crack. The man's head snapped back, his night vision goggles shattering as he was sent reeling into the doorframe. He hit the floor in a heap of tactical nylon and unconsciousness, the easy target having delivered a blow that would have killed a lesser man. Shuk hit the floor beside Sonnia, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. His legs were screaming, the nerves on fire, but he didn't stop. He crawled over her, his hands trembling as they moved toward the fallen assassin's sidearm. Don't touch her, Shuk hissed, his voice sounding exactly like the Mafia boss, Kafingji, in his most lethal moments. Across the room, Chuk emerged from beneath the bed, his own fear transformed into a cold, clinical focus. The twins weren't looking at the door anymore. They were looking at each other. For the first time in their lives, the heirs of the Geum-Ryong Syndicate weren't waiting to be saved. They were the ones holding the line, standing over their fallen guardian as the remaining shadows in the hallway hesitated, realizing the broken boys had finally woken up. The nursery had become a graveyard of high-tech dreams and low-light nightmares. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sharp, chemical scent of the medical gel. Sonnia, slumped against the base of the bed, felt the world blurring at the edges, but her eyes remained locked on the hallway. The final assassin, the leader, stepped over his fallen comrade, his movements no longer professional, but erratic and fueled by a panicked, murderous rage. He had lost his team to a nanny and 2 cripples, and his pride demanded a blood debt. He didn't reload his weapon. Instead, he drew a long, serrated combat blade that glinted wickedly in the red pulse of the remaining monitors. Sonnia moved. Shuk screamed, his voice cracking as he tried to drag his trembling body toward her, but his legs finally gave out, pinning him to the floor. The assassin lunged, a shadow of pure malice. Sonnia didn't have the strength to swing the oxygen tank again. Her vision flickered, the silhouette of the killer doubling in the dark. But as she saw the blade descending toward the space where Chuk was still partially exposed under the bed frame, the last of her adrenaline ignited. With a guttural cry that sounded like a prayer, Sonnia threw her remaining weight forward. She didn't try to parry. She simply became a wall. The cold steel of the blade found its home, sinking deep into her side as she wrapped her arms around the killer, pinning his weapon arm against her own body. The pain was a silent explosion, a roar of white noise that drowned out the world, but she held on. She buried her face into the assassin's tactical vest, her blood soaking into his gear, refusing to let go, refusing to let him take one more step toward the boys. Not them, she wheezed, her grip tightening even as her strength ebbed. At that exact moment, the heavy reinforced windows of the suite shattered inward in a rain of diamond-like glass. The secondary power grid surged, and the room was suddenly flooded with the blinding, aggressive white light of tactical flashlights. "Drop the weapon," a voice thundered, the sound of the Geum-Ryong Syndicate arriving like a tidal wave. Kafingji's elite guard flooded the room, their suppressed rifles clicking as they neutralized the final threat. But as the assassin was ripped away from her, Sonnia's knees finally buckled. She began to slip toward the floor, her eyes searching the chaos. Through the forest of tactical boots and shouting men, she saw the twins. They were reaching for her, their faces wet with tears, screaming her name. The last thing she felt before the darkness claimed her was a heavy, trembling hand on her shoulder, the hand of the Mafia boss. Kafingji had arrived, but as he looked at the blood on his hands and the woman who had saved his legacy, the king of the underworld looked like a man who had finally realized what true power looked like. The chaos of the breach subsided into a haunting, clinical silence, broken only by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of tactical teams securing the perimeter. Kafingji stepped through the shattered remains of the doorway, his boots grinding against glass and splintered mahogany. He was a man who had seen death in 1,000 forms, a man who had ordered executions without a flicker of hesitation, but the sight before him caused the air to vanish from his lungs. The room was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving white of the emergency lights. In the center of the floor, Sonnia lay as still as carved marble, her skin a terrifying shade of gray against the dark pool of blood. But she wasn't alone. Shuk and Chuk were on their knees beside her, their faces streaked with tears and soot, yet their hands moved with a precision that defied their tremors. Shuk, the son Kafingji had once thought too fragile to hold a glass, was using his own belt as a tourniquet, his knuckles white as he tightened the leather above the wound in Sonnia's leg. His jaw was set with the same terrifying focus that Kafingji saw in the mirror every morning. Beside him, Chuk was holding a thick wad of sterile gauze against the blade wound in her side, his body leaning into the pressure, just as Sonnia had taught them during those long, physical therapy sessions that Kafingji had once dismissed as mere babysitting. "Stay with us, Sonnia," Chuk whispered, his voice a ragged command. "Breathe. You told us we were chosen. You don't get to leave yet." Kafingji moved toward them, his shadow falling over the trio. For the first time in 18 years, the Mafia boss felt the hot, stinging prick of tears behind his eyes. He saw the empty medical vials, the oxygen tank used as a shield, and the phone still recording on the nightstand. He realized then that while he had been building a fortress of steel and cameras to protect his heirs, Sonnia had been building something far more resilient. She had been building men. He sank to his knees, not as the head of the Geum-Ryong Syndicate, but as a father. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over the blood-stained hands of his sons as they worked to save the woman who had truly raised them. "She's still here," Shuk rasped, looking up at his father with eyes that were no longer those of a boy. "We won't let her go, father." Kafingji didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply bowed his head, the first tear falling onto the polished floor. In the wreckage of the nursery, amidst the blood and the broken glass, the Mafia boss finally understood that his greatest legacy wasn't the empire he'd built, but the fierce, impossible love this woman had ignited in his sons, a love that had turned two victims into survivors, and survivors into protectors. The retribution was not a spectacle of gunfire, but a cold, calculated unveiling of reality. Kafingji sat in the center of a windowless interrogation room, the air conditioned to a sub-zero bite. Across from him, the rival boss, the man who had funded the breach, sat strapped to a steel chair, his face bruised and his confidence evaporating into the sterile air. He had expected a bullet to the head. He hadn't expected a film screening. Kafingji didn't speak. He simply turned a sleek, high-definition monitor toward his prisoner. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy, red-tinted footage from the nursery. The rival boss watched, his eyes widening as he saw the elite hit squad he had spent millions to hire enter the darkroom. He watched them slip and slide on medical gel, looking like clumsy amateurs. Then, he saw the moment that made his breath hitch. Shuk, the crippled heir, lunging from the shadows with a roar that transcended physical limitation, using his steel leg brace to shatter the temple of a professional killer. "You called them a weakness." Kafingji's voice was a low, vibrational hum that seemed to rattle the very walls. "You told your board that my empire was a house of cards because my sons were broken." The footage shifted to the moment Chuk emerged, showing a tactical focus that mirrored his father's own lethal legacy, working in tandem with Sonnia to dismantle the last of the threat. The rival boss began to tremble, the realization sinking in that he hadn't just failed. He had accidentally forged his own executioners. He had forced the sons to rise. "My sons didn't just survive your men," Kafingji whispered, leaning in so close the rival could smell the iron and gunpowder still clinging to his suit. "They outclassed them. They outfought them. And they did it because they have something you will never understand, a guardian who taught them that their scars are armor." Kafingji stood up, the chair scraping against the concrete floor like a funeral bell. He didn't need to order the execution. The man in the chair was already dead inside, crushed by the weight of his own miscalculation. As Kafingji walked toward the door, he paused, looking back at the screen where Sonnia was being tended to by his sons. "The purge doesn't end with you," the Mafia boss concluded, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "It ends when everyone in this city knows that if they move against my family, they aren't just facing me. They are facing the warriors my Nanny raised." He stepped out into the hallway, leaving the rival boss in the dark with the looping footage of his own downfall, a silent testament to the fact that in the Geum-Ryong Syndicate, the most dangerous people were the ones the world had dared to underestimate. The golden afternoon sun spilled over the manicured hedges of the estate, painting the garden in hues of honey and amber. The air, once thick with the sterile scent of medical equipment and the copper tang of violence, was now filled with the fragrance of blooming jasmine. A month had passed since the night the nursery became a battlefield, and the silence that hung over the grounds was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the peace of a sanctuary. Sonnia sat in a high-backed wheelchair, a thick wool blanket draped over her lap to hide the heavy bandages still encircling her waist and shoulder. She looked thinner, her skin a shade paler, but the fire in her eyes had never burned brighter. Behind her, the rhythmic click of shoes against the stone path announced her escorts. Shuk and Chuk moved with a new, grounded confidence. Shuk pushed the chair, his grip on the handles steady and firm. He no longer leaned heavily on his cane. Instead, he carried it like a ceremonial saber at his side, a tool of his own making rather than a crutch of his limitation. Chuk walked alongside them, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, a habit inherited from his father, yet softened by the gentleness Sonnia had cultivated in him. They were 18, legal adults by the world's standards, but in this garden, they were something more. They were guardians. "Slow down, Shuk," Sonnia teased, her voice raspy but warm. "I'm an injured woman, not a getaway car." "You taught us that speed is a tactical advantage," Sonnia, Shuk replied, his lips curving into a rare, genuine smile. "We're just practicing." They stopped by a koi pond where the water rippled like liquid silk. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in the dark and tempered in blood. Kafingji watched them from the high balcony of his office. He had dismantled the hidden cameras in the garden weeks ago, realizing that some things were too sacred to be viewed through a lens. He saw his sons, the boys the world had called broken, standing tall and alert, their bodies positioned instinctively to shield Sonnia from any sudden breeze or perceived threat. They weren't his patients anymore. They were the future of the Sun legacy, transformed by a woman who had seen the warriors beneath the tremors. Sonnia reached out, taking a hand from each of the twins. Her journey from a foreign babysitter to the heart of a mafia empire was complete. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, protective shadows across the grass, the three of them stood as a living portrait of a family that had been broken by design but rebuilt by choice. The cameras were off, the monitors were dark, and for the first time in 18 years, the heirs of the Ryong estate were truly safe, protected by the very love that had nearly cost them everything. The end. Please, before you go, kindly like and subscribe. It helps the channel's growth. You can also watch our other videos.